Yes, well, it's always a great pleasure to be speaking to the Bruges group. And as Kate very properly said, this has been an inspiring supporter of freedom from the European Union, really ever since the group was founded. And I, like I suspect many in this audience, have twice now voted in a referendum for us to leave the European Union. General de Gaulle was a difficult Frenchman. He rejected, lots of them about, by the way, he rejected Britain's application to join the common market in 1963 on the grounds that England was different from the continental countries. And I share that political judgment. In my view, several unexpected events led up to last year's surprise vote for Brexit. I say surprise, though I won quite a lot of money by betting on a Brexit outcome. One, UKIP's rise led the Conservative Party to promise a referendum. Two, Labour ran a poor election campaign in 2015 and the Lib Dems were almost wiped out. So the Conservatives did win a small overall majority, and Cameron honoured his referendum promise, expecting to win easily. Three, he and the European Union both misjudged the chances of Brexit. The UK failed to demand significant reforms after his Bloomberg speech, and the EU, of course, failed to offer any. Four, and this hasn't received too much publicity, I think, of the two rival Brexit groups, one stressed immigration, the other constitutional matters. So the Remainers were unable to pin down a single set of arguments to attack. It made their campaign much more difficult to win. And finally, of course, the government's over-the-top Project Fear propaganda backfired badly. Now, the EU's perverse interpretation of Article 50 has got them into a real mess. The key sentence reads as follows, quite a long one, I'm afraid. In the light of the guidance provided by the European Council, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with that state wishing to leave, setting out the arrangements for the withdrawal, taking account of the framework for its future relationship with the Union. Well, that's the English version. The EU seems to be using the gobbledygook version, which clearly doesn't take account of the framework for its future relationship. Of course, the EU could have been more flexible. After all, it chose to ignore the Stability and Growth Pact when that didn't suit Germany and France. They can be flexible when they choose to be. Agreeing new trade agreements on leaving the EU was never going to be easy, partly because they are such lousy negotiators. Look at how few trade agreements the EU has actually managed to conclude in all the years since the Single European Act. I do agree with the European Commission on one thing. I too regard Brexit as a political issue. It expresses our national preference for being an independent, democratic, sovereign state rather than a province of an ever closer union which hardly any of us want, ruled by unelected and unsackable foreign politicians. Last year, in the referendum campaign, PricewaterhouseCoopers produced estimates for our long-term economic prospects that were far more credible than the government's. PwC reckoned that if we remained in the EU, by 2030, real UK income per head would increase by 29% compared with now. Whereas if we were to leave and trade on WTO terms, it would increase by 25%. The difference is only about 0.25% a year. In other words, the long-term economic pros and cons roughly balance out. I agree with that view. But I repeat, PwC thought under WTO rules by 2030 we'd be 25% better off than now. So by a different route, I agree with Kate Hoey. This is not about economics. This is not about numbers. Not at all. As a matter of fact, I've always regarded the economic issues as both small and evenly balanced, in a word, negligible. I'm not worried about the UK's economic outlook. I always remember Adam Smith saying there's a great deal of ruin in a nation when people like George Osborne start spreading depression and gloom around. Nearly all the world's economic growth will come from outside the EU in future. And there'll be plenty of exciting opportunities for the UK, both internal and external. Of course, we want the EU and its member states to prosper. They'll make much more satisfactory trading partners if they do. But their approach is complacent and inflexible. They're sorry we're leaving, as Kate said, because we're taking our chequebook with us. But they failed to make a serious offer of reform when they had the chance. We want to get on and implement the Brexit decision. Yes, we'd like a sensible agreement on our future trade arrangements with the EU, but it takes two to tango. Of course, no deal is better than a bad deal. But the Chancellor's threat, which is what it amounts to leave any spending on no deal until the last minute, hardly fills one with confidence. Nor is it likely to convince the EU that we're willing to walk away from a bad deal. That is essential to give us the chance of a good deal. David Cameron's government wouldn't allow our civil servants to do any planning for a leave vote before the referendum. That was grossly irresponsible. And the people mainly responsible were the 5 senior Remain voting politicians in that government: David Cameron himself, George Osborne, Theresa May, Philip Hammond, and Michael Fallon. They are the 5 senior politicians who carry the main responsibility for that disastrous decision. I reckon the Treasury is heading down the same path as the Foreign Office. As you may recall from Yes, Prime Minister, the Foreign Office uses a 4-stage strategy. 1, nothing's going to happen. 2, something may happen, but we shouldn't do anything about it. 3, maybe we should do something, but there's nothing we can do. 4, maybe we could have done something, but it's too late now. The House of Commons can vote against accepting a no-deal outcome till they're blue in the face. But if there isn't a deal, then we'll be leaving the EU without one. All the loyal opposition is doing is undermining the UK's negotiating position. Anyway, when is the last minute? We are legally obliged to remain in the EU until 2 years after the triggering of Article 50. But if we continue to see little prospect of a trade agreement in good time, we should make the provisional decision to walk away before the end of this year, 2017. We need at least 15 months, we could have done with more, to organise properly for a no-deal outcome. In order to convince the EU that we're prepared to walk away without a deal, we must start now. Churchill always used to say, action this day. Well, it's a weekend, so we'll give them till Monday, but we really should get started. Much media gossip is heavily biased in the EU's favour. I should know, since I read The Times, the Financial Times, The Economist, and the Evening Standard, and watch the BBC. The fact is, most of us have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. It does seem quite likely we might end up with no deal, and there may well be serious technical problems that can't easily be resolved in time. It's possible the European Parliament might vote against any deal if there were one, as many of their members do want to punish us for leaving. Both sides are making the same mistake as before. We assume we'll get a trade deal at the 11th hour, even though by then it may be too late. Many British businesses will already have made other arrangements. The EU can't believe we'll walk away. if we do end up with no deal, I predict both sides will say they couldn't possibly have foreseen it. Suppose we do crash out over the cliff edge, to use suitably neutral language. We currently export less than 30% of our national output. Under half our exports currently go to the EU, probably about some 12-13% of our output. The other 87 or 88% of our output we don't export to the EU. If we end up trading under WTO rules, no doubt there'll be some serious short-term problems. But let's not take too much notice of the attempt to rerun Project Fear by people who are keen to pretend no deal would be a complete disaster. And I'm using, as you'll notice, the same words as Kate Hoey. Suppose we lost as much as 10% of our current level of exports to the EU, which I reckon is a much higher proportion than is likely. Even that only amounts to 1% of GDP. Not good news, but hardly a cataclysm. We'll soon be free to seek trade agreements with other countries across the globe, and we'll be working 100% on our own behalf, instead of having only a 1/28th share of the Swedish Trade Commissioner's effort. She negotiates for the whole EU, of course, whose trade interests, incidentally, are very different from our own. That's one of the respects in which the British economy is very different from the continental economies. Always has been, and still is, even after more than 40 years of membership of this wretched club, which was supposed to integrate and make economies converge. It's failed in that as in so much else. Since the referendum, most people who would have preferred the UK to remain in the EU have been pessimistic about our economic prospects. I came across a quote the other day, in a footnote too, that shows I'm a real academic, by Joseph Schumpeter, famous economist, who said, pessimistic views always seem to be more profound than optimistic ones. But since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the economic optimists have been right, and the pessimists have been wrong. Thanks to massive economic growth, the planet's population has increased more than tenfold, as has average real income per head worldwide, and in the past 100 years, absolute world poverty has fallen enormously. And that's due to the tremendous growth and economic benefits that the Industrial Revolution and sort of free markets have brought. The EU is desperate for the money, and again, I'm echoing Kate Hoey. The highest net total divorce bill I've heard of is 60 billion euros. But amortising that amount over 15 years, and I think we're all agreed it's the long term that we need be worried about, not immediate short-term difficulties. 15 years is a sensible sort of period to take. Amortising that amount over 15 years makes less than £4 billion a year, about 0.2% of our GDP. For once, I agree with Martin Wolf in yesterday's Financial Times. He thought it hard to get too excited about that, and he's right. Indeed, if that were to be the price of escaping from the EU, I'd regard it as the best investment the government is ever likely to make. Certainly a great deal better than vanity projects like HS2 or Trident. When I wrote last year to congratulate my former student, David Davis, at the London Business School, I should say, not Cranfield, on becoming the UK's chief negotiator, I reminded him, again being an academic, of the Greek word katalassein, which as well as meaning to exchange, also means to turn from enemy into friend. And I said that if the EU tried to block trade between the UK and our European neighbours, with whom we've been trading for more than 400 years, there was a risk they could achieve the seemingly impossible and turn Britain from friend into enemy. Unless the EU changes its hostile attitude, which there's little sign of so far, we might be leaving at the end of March 2019 without any agreement. No deal wouldn't be the best outcome for us, and it wouldn't be good for them either. But no doubt we'll follow the well-established EU rule, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. That means any provisional offers of money that we may have put forward during the 2 years after triggering Article 50 will be taken off the table. Then the EU would really have something to complain about. It would leave, again, I'm following Kate Harry, a nasty hole in their budget. Of course, they could try suing us in the courts, but that would take years, and I rather doubt if they'd win very much. I gather the UK's strict legal liabilities are small. If in the end there were no deal, most of us in this country, fairly or not, would blame the EU. It could poison relations between Britain and Europe for at least a generation. What a triumph for a political project that 5 years ago won the Nobel Peace Prize.